Las Vegas. Early 1970s. A sealed room where nothing leaks by accident. Journalists, agents, insiders, people trained to read pauses instead of words. The air is controlled, professional, almost bored. The microphone is already live when Frank Sinatra speaks. No build-up. No edge in his voice. The Rat Pack. A short pause. Looking back, it was a mistake. No laughter follows. None at all. Cameras move instantly, not toward Sinatra, but sideways. Every lens finds the same man. Dean Martin. He doesn't smile. He doesn't shrug it off. He doesn't play the version of himself the world expects. For the first time in years, there's no mask. Just stillness. And everyone in the room understands it at once. This wasn't a casual remark. Not nostalgia. Not a headline designed to travel. It was a door being closed, carefully, publicly, without drama. What follows won't be loud. There will be no argument, no comeback, no scene. But from this moment on, the silence between these two men will speak longer, and hurt deeper, than anything either of them could ever say out loud. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. Las Vegas, late evening. Not a show, not a concert, a clean, controlled charity event where everything is designed to feel safe. Soft lighting, round tables, low stage. Reporters along the walls pretending to listen while waiting for one line they can carry out of the room. Frank Sinatra steps to the microphone without drama. He looks older than the photographs still running in magazines. Thinner. Sharper. A man who has learned to conserve energy and words. He speaks calmly, almost casually, about music, about time, about how things change whether you want them to or not. Someone near the front asks about the Rat Pack. The question isn't aggressive. It's routine. A door everyone assumes is still unlocked. Sinatra doesn't smile. He tilts his head slightly, as if checking whether he wants to answer at all. Then he says it, not loudly, not bitterly. Some things were a mistake. You learn that later. No names. No explanations. No punchline. The room reacts incorrectly at first. A few people laugh, out of habit. They stop almost immediately. The silence that follows is not theatrical. It's confused. Journalists glance at one another, unsure whether they've just heard a quote or a signal meant for someone specific. Dean Martin is seated off to the side, angled away from the stage. Not hidden, just not central. He's dressed simply, no attempt to perform. When the line lands, he doesn't look up. He doesn't reach for a glass. He doesn't shift in his chair. He goes still. For a man whose public identity has always been movement, the shrug, the grin, the lazy timing, this absence of reaction is violent. Those who know him well feel it immediately. This isn't restraint. It's a decision. Dean doesn't glance toward Sinatra. Doesn't check the room. He lets the sentence exist on its own, unchallenged, unsoftened. In that moment, it's clear to anyone paying attention, Rat Pack was never a joke to him. It wasn't a headline or a costume. It was work. Years of nights carried on his back while pretending not to care. Sinatra continues speaking, but the rhythm is gone. The audience is no longer with him. They're listening for echoes instead of words. An organizer approaches the stage quietly. Another signals the band to hold. The schedule begins to collapse without announcement. What was meant to stretch comfortably into the night starts folding inward. The event ends early. Apologies are made. Cameras are lowered. People leave with the uneasy feeling that something private has happened in public, and that no one will be able to explain it cleanly. Dean stands, nods to no one in particular, and walks out without urgency. No anger. No performance. Just distance. By the time the doors close behind him, everyone understands the same thing. That line was not meant to start a fight. It was meant to end something. And Dean's silence was not confusion. It was recognition. Years earlier, long before anyone tried to rewrite it, the Rat Pack was never what the audience imagined. There was no brotherhood sealed by loyalty, no endless laughter after the lights went down. What existed instead was an arrangement, practical, fragile, profitable, and exhausting. By the late 1950s, Las Vegas had learned to package danger as elegance. Casinos wanted chaos that could be controlled, rebellion that still sold drinks. Sinatra understood this instinctively. He knew how to stand at the center and let others orbit him. The Rat Pack wasn't born out of friendship, it was assembled out of usefulness. Dean Martin was essential, not because he demanded space, but because he absorbed it. On stage, he looked careless. The loosened tie, the half-drunk posture, the timing that landed a beat late on purpose. Audiences believed they were watching a man who didn't need to try. Backstage told a different story. Dean arrived early. He knew the arrangements. He watched the room. He adjusted when others pushed too hard or lost focus. When Sinatra tightened control, Dean softened the edges. When egos flared, Dean redirected attention away from the fracture. He didn't compete for dominance. He kept the machine moving. Financially, the myth collapses even faster. Sinatra negotiated the power. Others took the headlines. Dean often took less money, not out of loyalty, but because someone had to keep the nights from falling apart. He carried shows that went long, crowds that turned unpredictable, moments when the energy dipped and needed rescuing. The drinking was real, but it was curated. On stage, alcohol was part of the act. Off stage, Dean was precise. He knew exactly how much he could afford to lose, and where the line was. The discipline wasn't visible, which was the point. If the audience saw effort, the illusion failed. Rat Pack schedules were brutal. Cities blurred together. Hotels became interchangeable. There was no room to slow down, no space to question whether this life could last. Sinatra began to feel it first. Control started to feel like confinement. The image that had once elevated him began to limit him. Dean felt it too, but differently. He never mistook the pack for permanence. To him, it was a phase of work, not an identity. Something to give everything to, knowing it would end. That difference mattered. As Sinatra's frustration grew, he began to see the group as an anchor. A symbol of an era he wanted to outrun. Dean didn't argue. He didn't correct the narrative. He kept showing up, kept performing, kept playing the role that made the whole structure believable. There was no romance in it. No nostalgia while it was happening. Just repetition, pressure, and an unspoken understanding that someone had to hold the center while others expanded outward. By the time people began calling the Rat Pack a legend, those inside it already knew the truth. It wasn't friendship that made it work. It was endurance. And Dean Martin carried more of that weight than anyone ever admitted. After the night in Las Vegas, nothing was announced. That was the first sign. No statements followed, no clarifications slipped to columnists, no quiet reassurance passed through mutual friends. The silence wasn't accidental. It had shape. Frank Sinatra stopped calling. Not dramatically. Not with intention anyone could prove. The phone simply didn't ring the way it used to. Invitations arrived addressed to one name instead of two. Meetings were handled through assistants where once there had been direct contact. In Hollywood, absence is never neutral. It is a message that pretends to be coincidence. Dean Martin noticed immediately. He always did. Years of reading rooms had trained him to feel changes before they were visible. The shift wasn't personal in tone, there was no anger in it, but it was final in posture. Sinatra was moving forward, and he wanted no loose threads behind him. Dean didn't reach out. Not once. No call to clear the air. No dinner request framed as nostalgia. He didn't ask mutual friends to soften the distance or explain his side. This wasn't pride. It was clarity. Dean understood something most people miss: explanations don't repair exits. They only make them louder. For Sinatra, the Rat Pack had begun to represent a past he couldn't control anymore. The world was changing. His image needed sharpening, not sharing. He wanted authority without echoes. The group, once a symbol of dominance, now felt like a reminder of limits. Dean didn't argue with that logic. He simply refused to absorb the blame. He had done the work. He had carried the nights. He had never asked the pack to define him, and he wouldn't let it be rewritten as his mistake. Silence became his position because words would have implied guilt, or worse, negotiation. Roles shifted quietly. Where Dean had once been the stabilizer, he now stepped aside without ceremony. Not as a rejection, but as a release. He allowed Sinatra to leave without resistance. That choice changed the balance more than any confrontation could have. People around them sensed it. Something adult had replaced something familiar. There was no feud to take sides in, no narrative to repeat. Just a widening space that no one dared to cross. Dean continued working. Television, records, appearances, all steady, all professional. He didn't reference the past. He didn't trade on it. For a man so closely associated with ease, this restraint required more discipline than any performance he had ever given. The distance hardened into form. And in that form, Dean's role transformed. He was no longer the partner, no longer the quiet counterweight. He became the one person in Sinatra's orbit who did not ask to stay. That refusal, calm, unspoken, absolute, set the stage for what was coming. Because when silence is chosen deliberately, it stops being passive. It becomes an answer. The separation did not announce itself with drama. It revealed itself through omission. A charity gala in Los Angeles, carefully staged, immaculately timed. The kind of evening where attendance mattered more than speeches. Names on place cards were read before guests arrived. Photographers knew exactly where to stand. Everyone expected the same image they had seen for years, two figures sharing space without effort. Only one appeared. Frank Sinatra moved through the room with practiced ease, greeting donors, smiling just enough to suggest control. Nothing in his posture hinted at tension. But there was an empty chair beside him, left untouched, unadjusted. No one filled it. No explanation was offered. People noticed. Not loudly. Not immediately. At first it registered as a detail that didn't align. Then as a pattern. A few heads turned toward the entrance, instinctively waiting for a late arrival that never came. The absence grew heavier as the evening went on, drawing more attention than presence ever could. Dean Martin had not declined publicly. He had not been announced as unavailable. His name simply vanished from the context where it had always existed. That disappearance did the work rumors never could. By morning, speculation spread, quietly at first, then with momentum. Was there a falling out? Was it drink, ego, resentment? Every version tried to force a familiar shape onto something that refused definition. No source could confirm anything. No quote surfaced. The story had no center. Hollywood doesn't tolerate that. Publicists waited for Dean to respond. They expected denial, clarification, anything to stabilize the narrative. It never came. Dean didn't grant interviews. He didn't release statements. He didn't correct the record. He let the vacuum remain intact. To the industry, this felt like defiance. Silence was acceptable when it served promotion. This was different. This silence created uncertainty, and uncertainty threatened control. Sinatra understood this better than anyone. He had always known how to steer perception, how to guide interpretation without raising his voice. Now the wheel slipped. Dean's absence forced a comparison that words never could. Sinatra was visible, present, active. Dean was nowhere, and yet impossible to ignore. The empty space followed Sinatra from room to room, from headline to headline, unspoken but persistent. There was no aggression in Sinatra's behavior. No public dismissal. But there was a tightening. His appearances grew more deliberate. His circle narrowed. He spoke less about the past and more about direction, legacy, movement forward. Dean did none of that. He continued working, appearing exactly where he needed to be and nowhere else. No references. No nostalgia. No strategic distancing. He didn't retreat, he refused to participate in the rewrite. That refusal unsettled people more than conflict ever would have. Because conflict offers closure. This offered none. What everyone witnessed wasn't a breakup, but an erasure attempt that failed to complete itself. Dean wasn't pushed out, he stepped away before the frame could close around him. And in doing so, he left behind something more enduring than argument. A visible absence that could not be filled. And could not be explained. By the time the invitation arrived, everyone understood what it was meant to provoke. Late-night television in the late 70s had learned to hunt moments, not conversations. The studio lights were warmer now, the hosts smoother, the questions framed as curiosity while carrying a blade underneath. Dean Martin had avoided this format for years. When he finally agreed, producers treated it like an event. They prepared carefully. The audience was briefed to listen. The host rehearsed neutrality. Somewhere backstage, a segment producer repeated the same sentence over and over, testing its rhythm, its weight. It was designed to land cleanly and leave no room to dodge. Dean sat in the chair with his hands folded loosely, posture relaxed but not casual. He looked older, heavier in the face, but clearer somehow. This was not a man unaware of the trap. This was a man who had already decided what he would not do. The conversation moved gently at first: work, schedules, the strange persistence of fame. Dean answered without stories, without embellishment. He kept the pace even. The audience leaned forward anyway. Everyone knew why they were there. Then the host asked it. Not sharply. Almost respectfully. Frank Sinatra once said the Rat Pack was a mistake. Do you feel the same? The studio inhaled. This was the opening. Dean could have dismantled a reputation in 30 seconds. He knew things no one else would ever say out loud. He could have reframed history, claimed credit, exposed control, hinted at resentment. The audience would have rewarded it. Headlines were already written in someone's head. Dean didn't move. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He let the silence stretch just long enough to make the room uncomfortable, not theatrical, but honest. You could feel the weight of years pressing into that pause. When he spoke, his voice was steady. Time doesn't go backward, he said. People were there. They did what they did. You don't fix the past by naming it. No defense. No denial. No attack. He talked instead about the musicians who traveled too long, the crews who never got mentioned, the nights that asked more than they gave. He spoke of work without nostalgia, of effort without bitterness. He never said Sinatra's name again. The host tried to follow up. Dean gently redirected. Each answer closed a door without slamming it. It became clear, minute by minute, that this was not restraint for show. This was refusal. Producers watched the clock. The audience waited for something sharper that never came. Ratings would be fine, but something else had slipped away, the spectacle they'd been promised. Dean had chosen the harder route. He left the studio without shaking hands for the camera, without lingering for applause. Backstage, no one knew how to approach him. There was a sense of loss that didn't make sense yet. Because what Dean had done wasn't kindness. It was boundary. He had been given the chance to destroy a man who had already distanced himself. And he had declined, not out of forgiveness, but out of self-respect. The most painful truth remained untouched. And because it remained untouched, it stayed alive. By the early 80s, the story no longer needed witnesses to feel complete. Both men were still alive, still working, still mentioned in the same breath by people who hadn't seen them share a room in years. What had changed was not their relevance, but their proximity. They existed on parallel lines that never crossed. There were no public refusals, no dramatic exclusions. Invitations were extended carefully, filtered through layers of assistance and schedules that never quite aligned. Industry events learned to plan without assuming overlap. This absence became normal, and that normality spoke louder than any feud ever could. Then came the quiet attempt. Not from press. Not from promoters. From people who had known them long enough to understand what had been lost without needing it explained. A closed setting. No photographers. No agenda beyond the hope that time itself might soften what words never addressed. Frank Sinatra arrived first. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with age. Less guarded, less theatrical. The sharpness remained, but it no longer cut automatically. He spoke easily about health, about doctors, about the business becoming unfamiliar. Control still mattered to him, but it had narrowed. He wanted to decide how this moment would go. Dean Martin arrived on time. Not early. Not late. He entered without expectation. No hesitation, no visible tension. He greeted Sinatra politely, almost formally. Two men who had shared years now speaking as if they had shared geography, not history. They sat. The conversation stayed safely on the surface. Music they no longer listened to. People who had passed. The weather outside the window. Each topic moved carefully around the one thing neither of them named. It wasn't avoidance. It was recognition. Once spoken, that line could never be withdrawn. Sinatra waited. Not obviously. But he paused in ways that suggested he wanted something offered, an opening, an acknowledgement, a bridge. He was willing to talk, but only if the frame remained his. Apologies did not come naturally to him. Admissions even less so. Dean noticed. He always had. He understood that this was the last chance, not for reunion, but for clarification. He also understood that clarification would cost more than it would give. Some things, once explained, demand continuation. Dean had no interest in reopening what had already settled into truth. He stood first. Not abruptly. Calmly. He said it was good to see him. He meant it. There was no bitterness in his voice, only finality. No promise to stay in touch. No suggestion of another meeting. Sinatra didn't stop him. That was the moment of understanding, mutual, silent, complete. Not reconciliation. Not rejection. Acceptance. Dean left without looking back. There was no victory in it. No satisfaction. Just the certainty that boundaries, once crossed, do not heal by being revisited. They hold by being respected. After that night, no one tried again. And no one needed to. Because the story no longer belonged to conversation. It belonged to choice. Years later, when the rooms were smaller and the audiences more selective, the story returned in fragments, never announced, never framed for effect. It surfaced the way truths often do at the end of long lives, without witnesses who needed convincing. Frank Sinatra spoke of the Rat Pack again, once, in a private setting. No reporters. No tape running. Just a handful of people who had learned to listen without interrupting. The tone was different now. Less sharp. Less certain. He didn't call it a mistake. He called it something that couldn't be held. Something built for momentum, not permanence. A moment that demanded energy he no longer had the patience to share. There was no bitterness in his voice, only distance. The kind that comes after the argument has outlived its usefulness. What he did not say mattered more. He didn't mention Dean Martin. Not directly. Not indirectly. He didn't assign blame or credit. He spoke as if the separation had been structural, inevitable, almost impersonal. As if history itself had simply shifted direction and left no room for negotiation. Those who knew better understood the omission. Dean never responded to that revision. Not then. Not later. Not ever. He was asked, quietly, more than once. Friends hinted. Interviewers circled. Opportunities appeared where a single sentence could have closed the loop and satisfied everyone who still wanted symmetry. Dean declined every time. Not because he lacked words, but because he understood their weight. Any answer would have frozen the past into a final shape. It would have turned something living, complicated, unresolved into a quote. Dean refused to do that. He let the silence stand as it was, incomplete, uncomfortable, honest. He accepted that some stories do not belong to the people who lived them once time has taken over. They belong to those who feel the absence afterward. When their names were mentioned together, there was no scandal attached. No defining exchange. Just a question that never quite resolved itself: who left, and who remained whole? Sinatra named the era and moved forward. Dean named nothing. And in that choice, something subtle endured. Not victory. Not righteousness. Preservation. Because silence, when chosen freely, is not emptiness. It is form. It is boundary. It is dignity that cannot be revised by time or retold for convenience. The story ends there, not with an answer, not with reconciliation, but with a pause that never collapsed. And in that pause, the listener understands. Some words end relationships. Some words end arguments. But silence, chosen deliberately, is what remains when a man decides he will not let his past be reduced to someone else's conclusion.